dernière séance de ce congrès. N'oubliez pas qu'il y aura le banquet ce soir à 7h au restaurant de l'Ami. Si vous êtes sur le programme, vous êtes d'office invité. Et si vous êtes inscrit lors de l'inscription en ligne également, si vous ne vous êtes pas inscrit, mais vous voulez quand même venir, venez me voir, après il reste place. Alors je vais présenter les deux conférenciers d'aujourd'hui et ensuite nous allons passer la parole aux deux conférenciers et on finira avec une sorte de format table ronde, discussion parmi l'auditoire. Donc quelques questions qui ont été coupées avant, on a l'opportunité de les poser maintenant, ou s'il y a des réflexions plus globales au cours de ces derniers 2 jours, c'est l'opportunité de les élaborer, de les tester. Je commence avec Denis Delage, who is a historian and sociologist emeritus at the Université de Laval. Denis Delage did his BA in History at the University of Montreal and an MA in Sociology, and his PhD at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales under the direction of Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. Denis Delage began his scholarship at a time when native colonial relations were far from the mainstream of historians of Quebec and of New France. These were dominated by discussions of habitants and seigneurs, by conversations about the church in the St. Lawrence Valley. It was dominated by social history, agricultural history, and political history. This began to change with the publication of Le Pays renversé, Amérindiens et Européens en Amérique du Nord-Est, 1600 à 1664, publié en 1985, translated into English and published by UBC Press as Bitter Feast, Amerindians and Europeans in Northeastern North America, 1600 to 1664. It won the Lionel Groulx Prize from the Institut d'Histoire de l'Amérique Française for the best history book, as well as the John Porter Prize for the best book in the social sciences. And that was the beginning of an eminent career that changed the field of the history of New France, I think it's fair to say. Denis Delage is the author of dozens of books and articles on Huron society and the Great Peace of 1701. He's also trained numerous PhDs in history, including Alain Beaulieu, who we heard from this morning, so his influence continues. Among many other prizes, I would mention that only a few weeks ago he was awarded the very prestigious Prix de Gérard Parisot, not for any particular book or article, but rather for the overall body of scholarship over the course of his distinguished career. On November 27th, for those of you who are here in Montreal, he'll give his prize lecture at the University of Montreal. A major figure in the field of French Native relations from the colonial period, Denis Delage hasn't just expanded his scholarship in his own field, he's one of that rare species of historians who's made a powerful mark on the way that Quebec history is taught in high schools and universities here in Quebec. Our second commentator today will be Jack P. Green, who earned his BA at UNC, his PhD at Duke. He taught at Michigan State and Western Reserve before starting at Johns Hopkins in 1964, where he taught for 41 years, most of them as Mellon Professor of History. He has fellowships and awards that are too numerous to mention by my count. 13 monographs or essay collections, 8 edited collections, and that doesn't include the 40 books that he's overseen as series editor, or the dozens of book chapters, more than 100 journal articles, 235 book reviews. This is just the CV that I had, which was about 11 pages long. The full CV apparently runs over 100 pages. Among the works that I think are worth highlighting in the context of this conference, Peripheries and Center, published in 1986, which reshaped the way that historians thought about the colonies in the context of the British Empire and in the context of imperial history more generally. Pursuits of Happiness, the social development of early modern British colonies and the formation of American culture. Both of these books, among his many others, showcase his ability, his rare ability to synthesize and to combine local and imperial scales in history. He's been a huge force in the profession. He supervised 88 PhDs and trained a generation of scholars in colonial history, including Max Adelson, who presented yesterday, and Karen Wolf, who's now the director of the 100 Institute. Among his many professional activities, I would just note that he was director of the Atlantic History and Culture program at Hopkins in the early 1970s and early 1980s, and is in large part responsible for creating the field of Atlantic history as we know it today, so reshaping conversation that historians continue to have. For the whole field, in fact, I think Jack has been at the cutting edge of the field for half a century, opening up new areas of study, bringing vast bodies of unknown work to the attention of the profession and marking new subjects of conversation, challenging basic assumptions among the field. I was thinking yesterday while I was listening to some of the speakers that when Jack Green entered the field of colonial American history, because that's what it's called then, colonial American history, the field was dominated by studies of Puritanism, of New England villages. This was mostly what you would have found, the subjects that you would have found if you flipped through the pages of the William and Mary Quarterly. The problem back then was to explain how colonial history led to the American Revolution. We've spent 2 days here talking about empire, state formation, political identities, cultural loyalty, and more. Our geographic range has spanned much of the world, from Grenada up the Floridas through the North American continent out to St. Lawrence Valley, across the Atlantic to Ireland and Norca, all the way to India. And I think it's a marker of how much the field has changed over the last half century, and I think it's fair to say that this conversation would be largely impossible without Jack's scholarship. So it's a pleasure to have both Jack Green and Denis Village here to talk about, to give some thoughts on the conversations we've had so far.
Merci beaucoup François. Merci aux organisateurs, c'était un colloque remarquable. On pourrait dire l'Acte de Québec, c'est un court document, ça concerne le Québec et on en fait rapidement l'histoire. Mais dans ce colloque, on a souvent dit qu'on l'intégrait, on en faisait l'histoire intégrée dans l'Atlantique, mais c'était bien plus vaste. Parce qu'en réalité, nous avons parlé également de l'Inde, ce qui nous renvoie à ce que les Américains appellent le French and Indian War, les Européens la guerre de 7 ans, et ici la guerre de la conquête, qui était également une guerre mondiale, puisqu'elle a eu lieu en Inde, en Europe et en Amérique. On a souligné dans ce colloque que la transition de l'Empire et de l'Empire britannique et la nécessité d'intégrer des populations qui n'étaient ni anglo-saxonnes ni protestantes. Et on a, avec débat là-dessus, sans qu'il y ait consensus, mais souvent référé à l'expérience britannique de l'occupation et à l'expérience irlandaise de l'occupation britannique, jugée par les autorités politiques britanniques comme incertaine, trop coûteuse, comme ne représentant pas nécessairement la solution qu'il fallait appliquer au Québec, dans la vallée du Saint-Laurent, dans la province de Québec. Si on remonte à la fin de la guerre de la conquête ou de la guerre French Indian War, le mouvement, la tendance ou les débats autour d'une possible indépendance des colonies américaines étaient envisagés par les colonies, par les responsables politiques britanniques, de même que les autorités politiques françaises qui en avaient conscience. Et on craignait effectivement un mouvement d'indépendance des colonies britanniques compte tenu de la disparition de la menace française. Il y avait eu également, comme on l'a souligné à quelques reprises, aujourd'hui particulièrement avec Alain Beaulieu, ce qu'on peut qualifier de guerre d'indépendance des patriotes indiens qui défendaient donc leur autonomie et leur territoire, ce qui a donné lieu à la guerre de Pontiac et à la conclusion de traités que l'on peut interpréter, même si c'est doublé de la proclamation royale, comme correspondant au moins à des formes minimales d'imposition de la souveraineté britannique. Les autorités britanniques, comme on l'a souligné également à plusieurs reprises, ont fait appel à la proclamation royale pour contrer la guerre de Pontiac, pour pacifier la guerre ayant été longue, ayant coûté une fortune au trésor britannique. On fait appel où on proclamait cette loi, la proclamation royale, pour pacifier les Indiens, mais également avec l'espoir de bloquer l'expansion vers l'ouest des coloniaux américains, jugée source d'une possible indépendance. Soulignons au passage, c'est un aspect qui a été peu souligné dans le colloque, mais qui est apparu plus clairement cet après-midi, l'émergence de 3 questions nationales. La première pour les 13 colonies qui pourraient éventuellement devenir une nation, donc une entité politique autonome par rapport à l'Empire britannique. La question nationale des Canadiens conquis et celle globalement des Indiens en voie d'être conquis. La volonté britannique de contenir les coloniaux britanniques à l'intérieur des frontières déjà existantes était en réalité inapplicable. À cette époque, on souhaitait également l'assimilation des Canadiens français, et pour ce qui est des Indiens, on imaginait qu'ils allaient disparaître assez rapidement, avec la métaphore des représentants de peuples liés ou incrustés dans l'enfance de l'humanité, qui allaient grandir, se civiliser et devenir les Britanniques. Un aspect auquel, dans ce contexte, on a fait rapidement allusion, mais qui est déterminant, Douglas Bradburn en a parlé, Alain Maudieu, c'est la démographie et la croissance, la croissance des populations coloniales britanniques et françaises, d'ailleurs, en Amérique du Nord, qu'on a de la difficulté à s'imaginer, mais il faut le voir en termes de territoire. Il s'agit d'une population qui, pour l'essentiel, est composée de cultivateurs, donc qui est rurale, et qui double à chaque... et dont la population double à chaque génération, et il y a à l'époque 4 générations par siècle, ce qui veut dire qu'un couple a 32 descendants à la fin du siècle, ce qui veut dire une multiplication par un coefficient de 16. Ce qui veut dire que le territoire doit, en gros, s'étendre par un coefficient de 16 sur un siècle, et ce qui implique constamment la poussée vers l'ouest et jusqu'à ce qu'on atteigne le Pacifique, et pour l'acquisition de terres aux dépens des Indiens, qui vont justement favoriser le maintien d'une natalité et d'une faible mortalité exceptionnelle. Et de ce point de vue, on peut imaginer que tout projet impérial pour contenir les 13 colonies est illusoire, que ça ne tient pas qu'à la faiblesse des contrôles, mais ça tient à la force de la démographie. On a fait allusion dans ce contexte-ci, dans le contexte de ce colloque, aux rumeurs que craignaient, aux rumeurs qui couraient dans les 13 colonies, d'un encerclement par les catholiques, éventuellement de la création d'un système seigneurial partout à l'intérieur du continent, dans les Grands Lacs, même dans les Maritimes. Effectivement, il y a eu des tentatives des autorités britanniques de poursuivre la politique française seigneuriale avec des coloniaux britanniques. Effectivement, on a craint l'invasion catholique, bien qu'on peut imaginer le caractère aberrant de la rumeur, bien que réel, puisque 70 000 catholiques et 2 millions de coloniaux rendait peu probable la conversion au catholicisme. Néanmoins, cette paranoïa cache un phénomène démographique plus profond, et en même temps, moi je l'expliquerais comme une manière de désacraliser le pouvoir monarchique en disant le roi nous trahit, le roi renonce à nos fondements religieux, et ça ça légitimise notre processus de rupture avec l'Empire britannique. En 1774, on a souligné que l'acte de Québec n'est pas une totale nouveauté. On a souligné que le pluralisme juridique existait sous diverses formes déjà dans les îles britanniques. On a rappelé les traités de la conquête relatifs aux Canadiens et également relatifs aux Indiens, puisqu'il y a eu plusieurs traités de la conquête autour de Montréal, dans lesquels les Indiens se voient garantir leur possession, la liberté religieuse, le maintien des coutumes, et on pourrait dire en résumant des formes de pluralisme juridique, et ce n'est à vrai dire que très tardivement que la loi criminelle va s'imposer aux Indiens, à vrai dire pour beaucoup avant 1825. On a traité du pacte entre l'Empire et les Canadiens français et les Indiens contre les colonies, contre les 13 colonies. Il est certain que l'Empire britannique ne pouvait se permettre de perdre la citadelle de Québec, de perdre les Grands Lacs. Avec les Indiens, il y a eu une stratégie, non pas de... c'est expliqué par Alain Beaulieu aujourd'hui, non pas de reprendre clairement et explicitement la proclamation royale, mais plutôt de s'implanter davantage dans les Grands Lacs pour exercer davantage d'influence sur les Indiens. On a rappelé pour les Canadiens ce que plusieurs ont qualifié de Magna Carta pour les concessions faites relatives à la religion, aux lois, au système seigneurial. Magna Carta, oui, on peut dire, dans la mesure où effectivement ça s'est maintenu. Maintenant, c'est un contrat bien précaire, c'est doublé de contraintes, puisque les Canadiens sont un peuple conquis, et il y a eu également la menace de la déportation sur le mode des Acadiens si les Canadiens allaient se joindre aux Américains. Cette proclamation s'inscrit en même temps, et c'est un aspect qu'on n'a pas souligné, il me semblait que ça aurait été intéressant de développer davantage, dans une modalité de l'expansion coloniale britannique, qui est celui de l'indirect rule, qui est celui de l'association de peuples conquis au processus colonial. On y a fait allusion avec le traité de Stanwix, dans lequel les Iroquois ou les Six Nations vendent des terres de l'Ohio qui ne leur appartiennent pas, mais qui appartiennent à d'autres nations pour assurer la protection de leur propre terre. Et les Six Nations avaient justement, dans les rapports avec les Britanniques depuis le XVIIe siècle, le statut de première nation, de premier intermédiaire. Ils étaient élevés au-dessus des autres nations. Ils étaient celles qui étaient les intermédiaires avec les autres nations associées aux Britanniques, mais les autres nations qui devaient toujours passer pour les Iroquois pour parler aux Britanniques. Ce modèle de l'indirect rule a été bien analysé par, entre autres, Francis Jennings, mais il me semble qu'il est repris au Canada avec l'association justement avec les élites, c'est-à-dire qu'il s'agit ici, pour le pouvoir britannique, de s'associer les élites religieuses et seigneuriales pour leur garantir justement la liberté religieuse, les terres et leurs lois, dans la mesure où ils demeurent loyalistes, ce qui a pour effet de placer les élites dans l'œil du maître. Les élites doivent être prudentes tout en s'ajustant, tout en négociant pour ne pas hériter, pour plaire, avec souvent, éventuellement, une part de honte de soi. Est-ce qu'on peut comparer avec les pratiques similaires en Inde? Probablement, mais il y avait intérêt à comparer ce qui arrive, à poursuivre la comparaison pour les peuples conquis et en voyant comment s'applique la politique britannique d'élévation d'une nation ou d'une classe sociale au-dessus des autres pour l'associer au pouvoir. Et est-ce qu'émerge, entre guillemets, la figure du roi nègre, donc une figure ambiguë, on l'a bien souligné cet après-midi encore, de collaborateur, de sauveur, de bricoleur, de refondateur, mais en même temps, il s'agit d'éléments associés au pouvoir, alors qu'émerge toujours au même moment une deuxième figure, celle du rebelle, celle du rebelle républicain, que l'on voit au cours de l'invasion ou du mouvement de libération des Américains. Ça dépend de quel point de vue on le prend. Pour les Américains, ils venaient ici pour nous libérer du pouvoir colonial et non pour nous envahir. Il y a donc à côté de la figure du, si je peux dire, roi nègre entre guillemets, mais à côté de la figure des élites associées au pouvoir, il y a toujours d'autres fractions de la population qui sont porteuses d'une attitude ou d'une idéologie républicaine. Ce qui vient en même temps compliquer les choses et rendre l'analyse plus intéressante, c'est que tout n'est pas aussi simple, puisque l'Empire britannique, par rapport aux Canadiens, est porteur de davantage de liberté que ne l'était l'Empire français. Et de ce point de vue-là, il n'est pas surprenant que Voltaire, par exemple, ait célébré la victoire britannique, puisque c'était la victoire de la monarchie constitutionnelle contre une monarchie absolue. Il y aurait donc intérêt à poursuivre et en travaillant davantage sur le mode d'association des élites des nations conquises. Et on pourrait, à cet égard, s'inspirer d'un travail remarquable qui était fait par Gustave Beaumont, le collaborateur d'Alexis de Tocqueville, comme vous savez. Et les deux voyageurs devaient écrire ensemble, mais finalement, ils ne se sont pas entendus. Et Beaumont s'est plutôt intéressé au sort des peuples conquis en essayant de le voir du point de vue des acteurs plutôt que du système politique. Et les deux, et Beaumont et Tocqueville, ont assisté à un procès, puisque vous savez que vers 1834-35, de Détroit, ils sont venus à Montréal et à Québec. Ils ont assisté à un procès d'un habitant qui ne parlait pas anglais et qui a été jugé en anglais. Et ils ont écrit « C'est un grand malheur d'être un peuple conquis ». Et Beaumont a décidé de travailler sur les peuples conquis et il a écrit un roman qui s'appelle Marie ou l'esclavage, et il a ensuite écrit une remarquable histoire de l'Irlande. Et dans son roman, il fait appel à la figure du noir, de l'Indien, du métis, du Canadien français, et ultérieurement dans ses travaux de l'Irlandais, pour traiter d'un autre aspect de la dimension coloniale, qui est la honte de soi, l'excès de générosité, le militantisme, donc toute le rapport au maître, où l'on est placé dans le regard du maître, qui définirait comme une forme d'aliénation, en même temps que lui et Tocqueville ont fait la promotion de la conquête de l'Algérie. Donc une critique du pouvoir colonial ciblé britannique à l'égard des Canadiens, mais en même temps un autre regard quand il s'agit de l'Algérie, sauf que Beaumont aura une attitude beaucoup plus avec marquée par beaucoup plus de compassion et plus humanitaire, on va dire, que celle plus froide d'analyse géopolitique de Tocqueville. Alors, ce que je dirais, c'est conclure en soulignant le caractère magistral des travaux, mais s'il y avait des poursuites à faire, je les ferais du côté de la mécanique d'association des élites au pouvoir colonial et des réactions et des divisions que ça suscite à l'intérieur des communautés de nous. Je vous remercie.
Merci.
I will begin by briefly thanking the organizers of this conference for asking me to participate in this wrap-up session of what has been a genuinely outstanding event. In general, the papers, all but two of which I got to read before the conference, impressed me by the depth and scope of the empirical research behind them, and by the authors' thoughtful efforts to relate their materials to larger questions on the origins, character, and effects of the Quebec Act of 1774. As a generalist and as a dabbler in this area, I have learned an enormous amount, much more than I usually learn at conferences, and for that I'm profoundly grateful. Partly because the time allotted me is short, I will not be commenting on the papers individually, nor will I try to bring out general themes they address, a task the authors themselves have done pretty thoroughly. Rather, I propose here to consider the more general problem of perspective, and my remarks could be entitled Contextualizing Quebec, some reflections on the construction and operation of the British Empire and the continuities therein. As this title suggests, the perspective that I myself employ in this case is the imperial, as opposed, for instance, to the regional, the national, the transnational, or the Atlantic, the possible merits and relevance of which I will not consider here. Before the British conquest of Canada in 1759, of course, and possibly even until the formal cession in 1763, the Quebec had been a part, and a very important and successful part, of the French Empire. And in terms of settler demography, provincial jurisprudence and governance, language, religion, and culture, it was deeply French. The result of a successful transplantation and creolization or adaptation of metropolitan norms, institutions, and social customs to an American site. The largest and most settler-rich territory transferred from any European power, imperial polity, to another in the Americas up to that time, Quebec in 1763 became a part of the British Empire, which found itself confronted with the problem of incorporating it into an ongoing imperial system. To what extent and how this Quebec question represented a new phenomenon in British imperial history, and whether the attempted solution to that question in the form of the Quebec Act was also new, and if so, in what ways, are questions that can only be fully understood by putting them in the context not only of the situation in 1763 and immediately thereafter, which many of the papers do quite effectively, but also of the entire English-British project of imperial construction over the previous 175 years, which relatively few of the papers have taken into account. The intention of this exercise is to challenge, or at least to qualify, what seems to be the underlying premise of this conference, that the acquisition of Quebec radically altered the character of the British Empire by requiring a novel and game-changing solution. Acquisition through conquest or treaty of American polities formed by settlers in association with a rival state was, of course, nothing new in the English experience. Jamaica in the 1660s, New Netherlands in the 1660s and again in the 1670s, Acadia and the French half of St. Kitts in 1713 were all earlier examples. And as many of the papers have noted, Quebec was only one of 6 such territories to come under British direction in 1763, the others being Florida and the 4 ceded islands. Moreover, as a result of its imperial wars, Britain had acquired well-populated colonial territories in Europe and Asia, Minorca and Gibraltar in 1713, and huge portions of the Indian subcontinent in 1763. Even earlier, over the course of the 17th century, the English had, through a combination of colonization and conquest, acquired dominion over Ireland, ostensibly stabilized with the Williamite settlement in the 1690s and the subsequent Protestant ascendancy. The British Empire dealt with all these diverse acquisitions in a variety of ways, as the situation seemed to call for. Where the local settler population departed or was driven out, as was the case in Jamaica and Florida, British agents of empire, and I did not say the state, had a fairly free field of operation in constructing new societies and polities along British lines. Where the residual settler population was small and equally important, where economic opportunities were sufficient to attract large enough numbers of immigrants for Britons to become the predominant population, as was the case in St. Kitts and the ceded islands, the process of assimilation to British norms was rapid and relatively easy, producing yet more variance in the congeries of British American polities and societies, no 2 of which were ever alike. The small residual populations of conquered settlers in areas that were unattractive to British immigrants, such as Acadia, could be left unassimilated to enjoy, with very light management, their own traditional jurisprudence, governance, religion, and customs, at least until their property and development made their lands attractive to prospective British settlers, when questions about their loyalty to the British Empire conveniently arose and provided an excuse for expelling them. Older and more densely occupied acquisitions in Europe, such as Minorca and Gibraltar, could be entrusted to garrisons and otherwise left largely free themselves, free from English cultural imperialism and safe in their enjoyment of their old modes of law, governance, religion, and culture. Areas with subsequent settler, or in the case of Ireland, indigenous populations that stayed behind had demanded variations on these approaches. Expulsion, the ultimate Acadian solution, was not a possibility. Because they attracted steady streams of immigrants, and perhaps also because the ethnically diverse Dutch settlers were Protestant, the colonies that developed out of New Netherlands, Delaware, and New Jersey, and New York could be left to assimilate to the common law culture of the growing British majority, although their numbers dictated that the process would be gradual, on occasion openly contested, and for at least a century after conquest, less than comprehensive, based to a considerable extent on a failed attempt to coerce the overwhelmingly numerically superior Catholics into becoming Protestants by denying them civil equality and by subjecting them to countless other disabilities. Ireland, after 1690, had rapidly become a caste polity, in which the minority Protestant population, probably never more than a third, owned over 90% of the land, entirely controlled the political and legal spheres, and enjoyed in their own Irish parliament a facsimile of the English system of consensual government, complete with the traditional protections of English common law, culture, sans only habeas corpus. While the Catholic majority of undersettlers were emasculated civically, and a large proportion of them reduced to poverty and driven in desperation to immigrate to the continent or to the colonies. Somewhat to the embarrassment of those Irish political leaders who were deeply informed by the principles of English jurisprudential, Whig, and liberal discourse, this system of oppression was held in place by a standing army, eagerly paid for by Irish parliamentary appropriations. Whether the large and deeply ensconced French and Catholic population of Quebec, whose situation in 1763 was not dissimilar to that of the indigenous Irish in the 1590s, would go the way of Ireland was an open question when the Treaty of Paris ceded Quebec to Britain. Indeed, the Proclamation of 1763, with its promise of British liberty to prospective immigrants, pointed directly in that direction. Not just in Ireland, but in Britain itself and in most American colonies, whether they were in British liberty was highly exclusionary. It certainly, and that's a subject that hadn't received nearly enough attention, I think, in this conference. It certainly did not extend to dependents, whether they were enthralled to masters, husbands, fathers, or Rome, or whether they were merely the victims of impoverishment and cultural deprivation. That the denizens of Quebec did not suffer the fate of Ireland, and this is my principal point, was the direct result of the application to Quebec of long-standing traditional English practices in dealing with distant and increasingly complex and highly competent lawmaking and law enforcing polities. That all government is founded on opinion was one of the most familiar aphorisms of early modern political analysts. The main point that this aphorism was meant to convey was that rulers cannot govern with authority or for long without the support of the governed. Sir William Temple, the late 17th century political essayist, provided one of the fullest and most penetrating discussions of the implications of this aphorism, spelling out the critical distinction between power, which connoted strength, force, and might, and authority, which implied legitimacy, was associated with justice and right, and was derived from popular regard, strengthened and confirmed by custom and habit. Taylor, in his essay upon the original nature of government, declared that the ground upon which all government rests stands, the foundations for all genuine authority, was the consent of the people, or the greatest or stronger part of them. If, as the literature on early early modern European state formation confirmed a couple of decades ago, this dictum was an accurate description of the relatively new composite national states of early modern Europe, in which national state authority was circumscribed, legal, customary, and institutional pluralism was general, and law could, as in England, differ substantially from one locale to another, according to local custom. And this, if this applied to those states, it applied with even greater force to the distant polities that Europeans of many states had been establishing all over the Americas. Indeed, a distance, along with cultural inheritance, limited metropolitan physical and coercive resources, and lack of sustained metropolitan attention were crucial ingredients in this development. Such conditions dictated that authority in all early modern empires would be divided as a result of negotiated and repeatedly renegotiated settlements between metropolis and overseas polities, in which, using Temple's language, the greater or stronger part of American settler populations would have an astonishing amount of control over the domestic affairs of their respective polities. A strong voice in determining not only which and how much of, but also whether metropolitan directives would be enforced within those polities, and an essential role in working out the details of the de facto governing arrangements for the empire as a whole. In the English case, too many scholars have too long and too easily assumed that the state was the principal agent in imperial expansion and governance, and that charters, royal decrees, parliamentary statutes, and metropolitan judicial proceedings determined structures of governance and legal environments and were to a great extent binding, that is, authoritative, within the colonies, creating an imperial sphere in which metropolitan directives defined what was constitutional and legal and what was not, and constituting a coherent and well thought out policy. But the actual situation was far too messy to render such assumptions useful. And the empire British agents produced was always defined far less by state policy than by practice. Settlers, and to a lesser extent adventurers and colonial entrepreneurs, supplied the vast bulk of the energy and direction for English colonial expansion into America. And working out and implementing systems of governance and law to meet their emerging collective objectives, they were not hesitant to modify or ignore charter prescriptions, or company, proprietarial, or royal directives. As Yulong Man showed almost 2 decades ago in his still, unfortunately unpublished dissertation, colonial governance throughout English America before the Restoration was the product not of metropolitan design, but of a trial and error process to which settler leaders sought to incorporate ancient metropolitan traditions of consensual governance and the rule of law into their respective polities, and in the process gradually worked out for themselves the tripart system I lost my place here. The tripart system of governance, it seemed to them to mirror metropolitan practice, a system that Crown officials subsequently appropriated in specifying a mode of permanent governance for Jamaica during the early 1660s, and that thereafter became conventional in all royal colonies. To be sure, during the Restoration era, newly crafted principles, the most important of which was that American settlers enjoyed consensual governance only as a result of the grace and favor of the Crown, and not as a right by virtue of their English inheritance, reinforced by decades of provincial custom, as settler protagonists adamantly and almost universally proclaimed. But these metropolitan efforts encountered fierce, and in almost all cases quite successful, resistance. Nor was the process of polity formation different in the many proprietary colonies founded during the Restoration, where the creation of systems of governance and law were all settler-driven, and where the Crown took over many of those colonies, and when the Crown took over many of those colonies between 1689 and 1730, it found itself confronted with well-established sets of institutions and laws, all differing in important ways from one another. With the exception of New York in 1691, Crown officials after Jamaica did not again have a relatively free hand in prescribing a form of government for any colony until the mid-1750s with Nova Scotia and Georgia. And even then, catering to the expectations of prospective settlers, they stepped short of actually giving law to a colony, something they never did, and never considered the possibility of trying to eliminate the consensual component from the governments they prescribed for those 2 colonies. Later, after 1763, they acted similarly in setting up forms of governance for the 4 ceded islands and the 2 Floridas, east and west. By these actions, London royal administrators served notice that thereafter they intended to take a more active role in the initial construction and subsequent monitoring of overseas polities. Only tight prescription and close monitoring could prevent them from following the example of earlier colonies. Throughout the century after 1660, the English or British state's primary instrument of control was the Crown's authority to review legislation, but only for the royal colonies and Pennsylvania. Before the middle of the 18th century, however, the often casual and inattentive monitoring of colonial legislation did little to alter a system of overseas imperial governance that routinely dealt with colonial problems on a colony-by-colony basis, and was rarely pressed in any colony beyond limits that would provoke serious provincial discontent or would encroach deeply upon settler control over domestic affairs. Never an empire held together by a strict enforcement of metropolitan regulations, much less by force, The British Empire was rather knitted together by consent, the extent of which was theoretically and many times experientially contested, but rarely to the point of open rupture. In these ongoing negotiations, exigency, distance, and metropolitan weakness contributed to the emergence of an arrangement that worked on the principle that the sweep of metropolitan authority was sharply limited by what settlers would accept. In the British imperial experience during the early modern era, the metropolitan government thus could only acquire and hang on to authority in its distant polities when it refrained from trying to exercise power in ways that those polities found inimical to their own provincial welfare or subversive of their images of themselves as free British subjects. Albeit, it could also gain affection by providing them with protection or otherwise ostensibly acting in their behalf. The metropolitan officials in an empire whose theoretical foundations, insofar as they existed, it's hard to call them theoretical, were so widely contested and so divergent from its implicit operating principles that such an empire would, during the consideration of the Quebec question, be indecisive and slow to work out a solution is scarcely surprising. What would have been deeply surprising, given Britain's imperial heritage, would have been for the Quebec problem to have been settled in any other way than accommodation to the opinions of the greatest or stronger part of the settler establishment. In Quebec, the French population, with its profound attachment to a deeply embedded and locally customary system of law, governance, and religion, was both the greatest and the stronger segment of the population. In bowing to the realities of this situation in the Quebec Act, the metropolitan government was demonstrating a powerful continuity with past practice, a practice that was not belied by the British experience in Ireland, where the Protestant minority may not have been the greatest, but was certainly, with the protection of metropolitan troops and its proximity to the metropole, the stronger part of the people. As an aside, it can also be argued that the same principles of adaptability, conciliation, and negotiation were at work in the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. The promise of no further parliamentary taxation and the partial repeal of the Townshend Acts in the late 1760s and early 1770s, the repeal of the Declaratory Act in 1778, and the concessions made to Ireland in the 1780s. At the same time, of course, the Quebec Act bore a sinister countenance for the many who believed strongly in the idea that the British was a free empire, distinguished by the extension overseas of its system of formal consensual governance with juries and parliaments, and a legal system consistent with English metropolitan traditions of the rule of law. Those who felt this way included most of those in Britain in their role, quite a lot of people who signed those petitions in favor of not coercing the colonies. Those people who opposed the administration's coercive response to colonial resistance to metropolitan measures after 1764. And they also included powerful colonial opinion leaders, not just leaders from the not yet historically reified 13 colonies that 2 years later would opt for independence and gradually stumble into the creation of a new federal state, but leaders from every British colony, from Barbados to Nova Scotia. To those who shared this view, the Quebec Act, with its denial of the English forms of consensual governance and common law jurisprudence to the minority of Old English subjects in Quebec, insofar as that was the case, appeared to represent a deeply disturbing discontinuity in British imperial governance. Notwithstanding the fact that the huge majority of Quebec's settler population was, by British definitions, unfitted by their slavish heritage and religion to partake of the benefits of a free British constitution, and would therefore, like the Catholic Irish, necessarily require exclusion from the civic roll. To colonial opinion leaders, the metropolitan accommodation to Quebec opinion was the more disturbing because it followed upon a long series of efforts to subscribe the scope of settler legislative authority over provincial domestic affairs. Efforts that began with more intensive and sustained Crown supervision and interference in those affairs after 1748, and was followed by parliamentary interventions thereafter. What was relatively and even radically new and discontinuous about the Quebec Act, as well as the Massachusetts government and Administration of Justice Acts endeavoring to alter the structure and character of Massachusetts provincial and local government that Parliament enacted at the same time, was the use of parliamentary statutes to prescribe the conditions of governance for a settler colony. The recent New York Restraining Act of 1767 being the only precedent for such action. These innovative measures emphatically suggested a metropolitan intention to change the character of British imperial governance by muting settler voices in the governance of overseas territories, and thereby infringing on ancient settler claims to British rights through inheritance and custom, and by eliminating those rights altogether in places where, like Quebec, British people represented, to return once again to Temple's formulation, neither the greatest nor the strongest element in the population. From this perspective, the important question for historians is not why all those colonial polities without a dangerous domestic enemy and an acute vulnerability to British naval strength decided that the only way they could secure their ancient rights was by severing their connection with Britain and making those rights the foundations for their own newly reorganized but quite ancient by that time polities. Rather, the central question is why the majority of the British political establishment after 1763 insisted, vacillatingly in 1764 to 71 and adamantly in 1774 and 78, on nibbling away at the extensive self-governing authority British colonists had enjoyed since the early years of English overseas expansion, and which metropolitan officials had never had either the coercive power or the physical resources to challenge effectively. That was the most radical aberration in British imperial practice during these years. This is not the place to consider this knotty question in detail. In brief, however, the explanation of this change in direction is principally to be found in a combination of the British Empire's phenomenal economic success, and by all measures, it was phenomenally a successful enterprise by the middle of the 18th century. A growing metropolitan fear that Britain would not be able to retain the increasing economic and strategic benefits of empire without exercising greater dominion over it, and a heady sense of national invincibility growing out of British achievements during the final years of the 7 Years' War. As, however, the course of the American War, the settler revolt that is sometimes called the American Revolution, steadily revealed the limits of British coercive power over distant parts of the empire and the difficulties of subjugating distant populations without their consent, the British political establishment fell back upon the old strategy of negotiated compromise. The repeal of the Declaratory Act in 1778 did not persuade the revolting colonies to return to the fold, but it did lead to a considerable expansion of consensual governance in all the colonies that remained in the empire, while the grudging concessions to Ireland in the early 1780s again demonstrated the pertinence of Temple's aphorism that authority depends on the good opinion of the government. Much the same can be said about the extension in the early 1790s of consensual government to Quebec, where the majority of population proved remarkably adept in adapting to English-style parliamentary government and using it for their own purposes. As a result of the acquisition in 1763 of not Quebec, but India, with its vast and thoroughly alien population, Britain did indeed slowly develop an entirely new and less participatory form of empire building and maintenance, a form that would contribute to the bifurcated empire of the 19th century. One segment followed the ancient pattern and involved extensive domestic self-governance and spread from the old and new West Indian, Atlantic Island, and North American colonies to the rest of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. The other segment functioned as a managed empire without formal consensual institutions, in which most colonies had one law for settlers and managers, and one or more law for the indigenous majority. This system spread widely throughout Asia and Africa. But to return to the Quebec question, among all the political transfers from one European power to another, from the 17th through the 19th century, Quebec is quite an anomaly, being the only one in which the transferred population was able to exhibit a substantial degree of colonial retention. This was not, I'm pretty sure, the hidden design of the Quebec Act. The authors and proponents of which probably look forward to a greater degree of assimilation to British norms facilitated by substantial British immigration into Quebec. And of course some assimilation there was, even if Quebec, in contrast to Ireland, never became a colony of over-settlement. But in explaining Quebec's extraordinary amount of cultural retention, the influence of the Quebec Act should not be underestimated. As I hope I've now persuaded you, early modern imperial governance over distant polities was necessarily founded on consent, not command. And the Quebec solution in 1774 was no exception to the rule. Nor, for that matter, was the recognition of the independence of 13 former colonies by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Much more powerful and prosperous states than any of those in existence in 1789 would have been required to govern distant polities in any way except by catering to opinion. Thank you.
Great. Well, after those summaries and comments, I think we have room for half an hour of discussion. What do you need? 12 minutes. I might, well, I'll ask a question, then we can go get it. I'll ask one question, suggest one possible response to some of the questions we were raising. But it occurs to me, and this came up a little bit in the previous, I think in the previous panel, and certainly with some of the conversations, but it does seem to me that one thing that might make the Quebec Act different, if it is indeed different or novel, is nothing really necessarily inherent to the Quebec Act. I mean, we talked earlier about causality. You know, is this coming from a long-term series of planning, or is it in response to immediate events going on in the late 1770s? But it might be a sort of broader question of timing, having to do with the late 18th century. I mean, it occurs to me that a lot of the issues that were being raised in the Quebec Act that we've discussed, having to do with citizenship, having to do with rights, having to do with the nature of identity. Are rights natural, or are they subject to loyalty? All these kinds of questions were going to be very much questions that are going to become increasingly urgent certainly over the next few years in the United States, and over the next decade in Europe. And also the question of the exportability of freedom, if that's what it is, and the exportability of uniform legal codes. This is something that Napoleon runs into. We were talking a little bit about this, but perhaps it may be that the Quebec Act, coming as it does in the age of revolutions, has a different valence than it would, let's say, if it had come half a century or a century earlier. So it's just the sort of timing of it, in the sense that might make it a more interesting moment, or might make those questions more pertinent, in a sense.
I've never liked that idea, age of revolution. Because I think I think the French Revolution is a genuine revolution. It does produce a uniform legal code, and it divides all the old polities up and mixes them together, and they make completely new polities. So this is a real change, because all those old polities had all these local rights and so forth, and that didn't happen in the United States. It didn't happen in the British. It didn't happen in the British Empire either. So I'm not quite so sure. I mean, I would be more open to suggestions that certain kinds of languages that were becoming important in imperial discourse as a means for judging the morality of English colonial activity, such as humanity and justice. I would be more persuaded that that had a really important impact on the shape of the Quebec. I think it did with the people who designed the Quebec Act. They could make a legitimate case. And when Nancy quoted what I had said in my recent book on Speaking of Empire, but that's not the title of it. It's the Cambridge University Press changed it. It's Encountering Empire. Pardon? Oh, Evaluating. That's right. I can't ever remember anymore. The 10 years I was writing this book, it was called Speaking of Empire. Suddenly it has a different title. And Confronting Colonialism, which didn't change. And I think that's, that's something that happens. And I like the intervention about Ireland, but I also agree with whoever said that the Quebec situation had a much greater effect upon raising metropolitan consciousness about the iniquities of the Irish Protestant treatment of Catholics. That was probably a more important result of this intellectual interchange, than anything that actually happened in Quebec, because as various Irish people said immediately and published things in London, if you're going to make those concessions to those French guys, why can't you do it as English-speaking Irish now? I mean, we behaved well for 80 years. And we haven't done anything. So I mean, there are lots of, I think there are lots of things. The significant thing is these advocates of humanity and justice as a standard of empire, and they provide an enormous critique of empire, which was very persuasive to a lot of people, and spilled over from the iniquities in India into things like slavery and so on, which in 1759. I mean, one of the great things about the Treaty of Paris, which people don't often mention, is the creation of all those new colonies in the West Indies. And they were going to be slave colonies, and they were going to be represent an expansion of slavery, and nobody doubted that. It's going to be great for the African slave traders. It's going to be great for Britain, or sugar profits, so on. And so that's not something people often talk about, but in 1768, 67, 68, and 69, Granville Sharp raises consciousness on this, begins to raise consciousness on this question. I think that comes out of the plunder of India and the outrage, not as late as Warren Hastings, but in 1764. There's a magnificent pamphlet about this. So I think there's a lot of things stirring here. I don't know where they come from. I can't say they come from enlightenment. It's enlightenment like mercantilism or words that I exercised from my vocabulary when I first began to teach. So they don't seem to me to have any meaning. They're sort of general, but I feel the same about revolutionary era.
That's it.
Je veux juste faire état malaise, c'est trop fort, mais d'une interrogation que j'ai. Le commentaire de Jack sur les empires négociés, les negotiated empires, sur finalement l'acte de Québec, quand on représente une autre itération de cette négociation, se heurte, j'ai l'impression, au terme des 2 jours de la conférence, ben, finalement, le désir que l'on a de trouver comment s'exprime ce consentement, comment s'exprime cette force, quelle est la position de négociation des Canadiens français pour lesquels on a finalement assez peu de témoignages. On doit se raccrocher à quelques pétitions, à quelques mentions. Et peut-être qu'il y a du travail à faire. Je pense qu'il y a Robert Engelbrecht qui a mentionné qu'on n'a pas particulièrement parlé des gouverneurs locaux qui, à tout le moins, auraient pu et ont servi de porte-parole auto-autorisés, si on veut, de ces revendications. Donc j'ai l'impression, et ça fait écho au fait que justement l'acte de Québec a une telle importance dans une historiographie québéco-québécoise, comme un moment marquant, charnière, ou ce qu'on veut, parce qu'on peut lui rattacher un consentement populaire, global, collectif. Et là, j'ai l'impression qu'on a des historiens qui, en fait, n'ont pas nécessairement des sources pour accompagner cette espèce de construction collective. Donc, simplement, c'est une espèce de commentaire en forme de bilan ou d'interrogation. Je suis curieux d'entendre ce que les collègues et ce que les commentateurs ont à dire là-dessus. Merci à vous.
I think here, it's just the sheer weight of numbers. How do you govern all those people and keep them happy when you don't have that much coercive power? But of course, you know, all of these negotiations take place in a very specific context. And what happens in them is very important to spell out. That's what's really been great about this conference, is spelling out so many details about that process as it worked itself out. But I want to go back also to Dennis's point and contrast the experience in Louisiana with the experience of Quebec in terms of the cultural retention. Granted that the Louisiana French population is small in comparison to Quebec, but nonetheless they can't hang on. They take great pride in Louisiana now, of course, with French civil law. But as recent scholarship has shown, just completely intermixed with English common law practices. And the first thing the legislature does is to say that common laws can run here. And it's this settler dynamo springing out of not one or two or three, but as many as 4 or 5, cultural hearths in North America that is so extraordinarily powerful, it just sweeps before them. So that every legislature in a new territory or a new state, one of the first things they do is say, the common law is the basis of our legal system. And of course, the other thing they're doing is instituting a legislative assembly. And you can say that has something to do with American republicanism, but it's a lot older than that. And it's an English phenomenon. And I think it's, you know, these things, so Quebec, the numbers were not there, and they were never overwhelmed to that extent. So it really is very interesting that Quebec is the place in the whole of the Americas where populations are transferred and they hang on to large portions of the cultural degree of cultural retention is so extraordinary.
I would certainly tend to agree, but the point I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact that though you have numbers, how does it actually happen? I mean, how are the actual, positions of negotiations constructed in a situation in which, in the aftermath of the conquest, you still have like a gigantic, in terms relative numbers of military troops on the ground. I don't understand like people wanting to appease things in order not to get into protracted struggle, and yet we're still, 10 years later. The idea that the historiography has made is that, this is buying loyalty. Well, how does that actually work? We're using a legal discourse that says of itself what it wants to say, but the inner working, and though, again, I tend to agree, numbers must have had something to do, but I'm trying to go to see if we cannot go slightly beyond a kind of mechanistic approach.
I think that it's very general, but I think that you're right to put your finger on local governance. It's how most government, of course, occurs in families. I mean, family governance is the predominant form of government. The next most important is in localities. That's something that people who work in English America haven't yet fully come to appreciate as well. But I imagine that having a kind of government that's congenial to that is important.
Anne Trépanier, voulez-vous intervenir là-dessus?
Moi, je vais intervenir. Parce que la question que soulevée, c'est où était le rapport de force des habitants. Parce que c'est très intéressant, là, tous les historiens, là, mais on est ici devant un acte d'État et peut-être ça aurait été intéressant d'avoir un géopoliticien. Okay? Alors, je vais vous identifier exactement où était le rapport de force des habitants parce que un acte de la conduite des États, c'est la politique, sa définition, c'est l'intérêt, le rapport de force et l'effectivité dans cet acte-là. Alors donc, si l'on consentit autant aux habitants, c'est parce qu'il y avait un rapport de force résiduel après la défaite de la France sur le territoire. Et puis, Guy Carleton l'a évalué précisément et dans une missive envoyée en février 1768, il avait fait l'inventaire du potentiel militaire des milices qui demeuraient et qui pourraient joindre la Révolution américaine. Alors, c'est pourquoi Guy Carleton a parti vers Londres, okay, parce que là, on est dans une question de statesmanship. Okay? On n'est pas dans le droit, ni dans les valeurs morales, ni le moral high ground. Là, on est dans la vraie business, les intérêts d'État. Et donc, lui, il a un sens d'État très développé de par sa famille. Et donc, il va partir à Londres, il va passer 4 ans pour convaincre le Parlement de Londres, l'État anglais, à passer cette loi-là. S'il ne l'avait pas fait, okay, il savait que très facilement, la Révolution américaine, les habitants auraient rejoint la Révolution américaine et donc la position britannique qui était dans une redoute à Québec, okay, aurait été balayée vers la mer et puis donc les États-Unis s'étendraient sur tout le continent et il y aurait une petite fleur de lys dans les étoiles du drapeau américain.
Il est certain que la peur de voir les Canadiens joindre les Américains a joué beaucoup. S'ajoute aussi, avant ça, c'est moins décisif que l'argument que j'avais avancé, une grande proximité aussi, surprenante d'ailleurs, entre les nobles britanniques en autorité politique à Québec et les seigneurs. On se retrouve dans le même univers de valeurs et on partage le même mépris pour les vulgaires marchands. Mais c'est secondaire, c'est marginal par rapport à la crainte effectivement que les Américains gagnent l'appui des milices canadiennes.
I'm just thinking about Yvonne's question here, as what explains in some ways what explains Quebec's survival in some senses, is kind of what she raised. And I'm just one of the things that I always think of is to put some of the emphasis back on the Canadians themselves and some of on their capacity to do things like, for example, make alliances. Strategic alliances, and in the face of very great adversity, very often, I mean, I understand our disagreements there, but she's absolutely right that there's a huge anti-French discourse that goes on all the way through, and yet they're able to find and develop alliances, not just in the 18th century, with the Seigneur and the Church Alliance to manage to find the right people to keep themselves going there, but even in the 19th century as well. I mean, there's the Forced Union in 1841, and then followed by, in fact, they were able to skirt around and find alliance, which actually ends up allowing for Lower Canada to...
Or resistance.
Oh,
or
sure.
resistance. Parce que they also are resisting. alliances and resisting.
Yeah, of course, yeah, well, well, absolutely, of course, and it's one of the things, for example, they refused to, after 1841, for example, they will refuse to simply follow, for example, the fact that they want to put English in place in the assemblies, for example, absolutely. But you can resist, but you also have, it's also even better if you can find yourself in alliance as well, at the same time as doing both of them together. And so, so I think that's one of the things that I see is this capacity for making these alliances that keeps on going. And again, I think there's something in the character or the capacity to do this that's actually rather interesting to explore, and that helps explain in some ways rather than simply standing aside, standing back, and saying, look, we're just we're going to just let these things wash over us. So I think sure, resistance. How about agency? Is that a good one?
No, because I think we have to accept colonialism, and if we don't accept colonialism as part of this, there's alliances, but that's also there's also this creation of them as being subordinate in that, I find that there's a dangerous part of having that spill over into saying they were just compliant. So I want to.
Compliant. Well, no, they weren't compliant at all. I'm not at all. They're able
Well,
to.
but I just think that there's a difficulty there with that.
Okay. Anyways, perhaps we can. Maybe it could be on the fact that there's something that comes from the Canadians themselves.
Yes, it does, but it comes also from having to resist in a really strong Anglo discourse that is, I don't want to say that the Anglos have created French-Canadian nationalism, but it's such an assault on them that they're forced into having to deal with that.
But anyway, I just made that his response.
Well, I like agency. My three principles for 40 years have been primacy of the 17th century, power to the peripheries, and agency of the settlers. And I think this works pretty well, actually, in talking about imperial governments, not just in the English-speaking world, but everywhere there are ways of modifying received law that are worked out. And so I think it probably does have to do something with the special character of Quebec and their capacity to ignore this chatter that you're talking about, or to just transcend.
We're gonna let Louis Jean.
Hey, what's up, you guys? I'm obviously Professor Green make a very strong case for the continuity within the British Empire and the practices. I'm just wondering what you make of the kind of idea of imperial revolution, the German alienist idea. That in fact, in terms of administrative practices, that the European empires are changing significantly from, say, the 1740s, 1750s on. And indeed, with the British Empire, we see that a change of the role of the governors and how they're given very specific instructions. To me, there's a kind of a form of executive federalism like this developing within the empire at this time. And in that sense, perhaps the Quebec Act can be integrated into a movement that began in the 1740s that creates something that's new and that perhaps precedes that second empire.
Well, in the British case, these are not new objectives. It's just that they're applied with more vigor. And at the same time, there's this new, there aren't new powers given to governors. These powers have been given to them all along. But what is not new is the absolute refusal of any legislature to put a suspending clause in their laws because London says they should. And the governor will lose his job if he doesn't. They continue to be very resistant to any of these prescriptions that they can avoid. And that's a great many of them.
But if we take your point about empire being kind of negotiating between the rulers and the ruled, And you can at least say that the position of the rulers changed.
Well, in its application. I mean, I think with urban reforms, there's much more going on there, and it's a much more systematic kind of phenomenon than occurs in 1763. I mean, all those maps that Max Addison laid out there, you know, there was a moment of enthusiasm there, which people thought, in London thought, gee, maybe we can finally change things, but then when they tried, they encountered massive resistance. And even in places which couldn't resist, they encountered a great deal of hostility. A number of political pamphlets and declarations and so forth coming out of Barbados and Jamaica, for instance, and Nova Scotia. Finally, in the early 1770s, is phenomenal. And it says essentially the same thing. We're not going to accept this.
Right. The question is stimulated because I recently was reading the instructions of Governor Murray, 1763 or 64, which are 25 pages long, 80 points, and it's very, very, very detailed. To me, that's
Well, these instructions have been, Doug, when did these instructions start giving? 1679 or 80, something like that? And they aren't much changed. I mean, they are changed in some details often, but not always. And but I mean, Quebec is a new situation, and Murray is a new governor, but they're copying. I mean, I wager if you looked at Leonard Labourie's royal instructions to British governors, that you would find most of those instructions repeated to Murray.
Je crois qu'on a le temps pour une dernière question.
Bonjour. Dans mes recherches, je n'ai pas trouvé grand-chose sur ce qu'avaient comme opinion les femmes ou les habitants concernant tous ces problèmes politiques. Mais ce que j'ai observé, c'est que dans le cas de Lepinière, quand il est revenu sous régime britannique pour gérer ses seigneuries, il a tenté de faire appliquer la loi française à la lettre. Et il se retrouvait devant les tribunaux avec ses censitaires. Et il s'est souvent fait dire que la règle qu'il voulait faire appliquer, n'ayant jamais été appliquée en Nouvelle-France pendant son existence de 150 ans, pourquoi on demandait à nous, les juges sous régime britannique, de maintenant les appliquer? Et je me mets dans la peau du pauvre censitaire qui était poursuivi. J'imagine qu'il était très heureux de comprendre qu'on allait continuer de ne pas appliquer les règles du Code de Paris. Alors, je ne sais pas si vous avez rencontré ce genre de phénomène-là plus largement que moi qui ai fait une petite recherche.
Donc, il faisait appel au commandant?
Non, Lepinière voulait faire appliquer la loi de la coutume de Paris à la lettre. Et les tribunaux, ils ont dit, marche pas de même. Ça fait 150 ans que vous n'avez pas appliqué la loi, c'est pas à nous autres de la faire appliquer. Donc, ils ont appliqué des principes de common law dans l'application de la coutume de Paris. Vous n'avez pas rencontré ça souvent?
Un bel exemple de l'agentivité, on va dire, de l'agency des colons, de leur usage instrumentaliste de la loi.
Je me mets à la place du pauvre habitant qui doit être relativement heureux d'entendre de tels jugements.
Écoutez, it remains only to thank Denis Delage and Jack Green for their stimulating comments, and to thank all the participants for all, I think, a wonderful 2 days of conversation and discussion.
Organized. Thank you, Fred.